Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tony Pham. I'm the new Acting Director for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Nearly 4 years ago, one of the first actions President Trump took after being sworn into office was to sign an executive order titled Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States. With this executive order, the President made it clear that his administration was focused on faithfully executing the immigration laws of this country. With the guidance of that directive and the safety and security of all American communities as our ultimate goal, we announced the results of Operation Granite. This enforcement operation tasked ICE officers in various areas across the country with identifying, locating, and arresting criminal aliens who should not be in the United States and whose continued presence pose a significant threat to public safety. The operation took place in Minnesota, as well as Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, and Texas. During Operation Granite, which ran from October 19th through October 23rd, the men and women of ICE enforcement and removal operations arrested more than 100 removable aliens. More than 70% of those arrested have criminal records that include prior convictions, pending criminal charges, or both. All of them are now in custody and placed in removal proceedings. Apart from being in the country illegally, those arrested during Operation Granite committed a range of the following additional crimes: kidnapping of a minor, domestic assault, burglary, sexual assault, cruelty towards a child, sexual exploitation of a minor, and robbery, just to name a few. The success of this operation also shines a light on the critical role of law enforcement in protecting victims of domestic violence. Earlier this month, the President signed a proclamation to establish October 2020 as National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. As the President noted, and I quote, "Domestic violence is an evil that threatens the social fabric of our nation. It is a widespread attack on the most sacred and intimate of institutions, the American family. Domestic violence tears families apart with devastating consequences that can last for generations. Tragically, more than 10 million Americans suffer at the hands of loved ones each year, and women are twice as likely to be targets of this heinous crime as men," end quote. In Operation Granite, we arrested 9 individuals with prior convictions or charges of domestic violence. In the 2 recent RISE operations, we arrested 17 individuals with prior convictions or charges for domestic violence. Specifically, ICE took several domestic violence offenders off the streets, including in Minnesota. We arrested a 43-year-old citizen of Mexico convicted by the Minnesota District Court of Hennepin County of domestic assault in addition to drug-related charges. Also during this operation, we arrested a 47-year-old citizen of Romania in Cambridge, Minnesota, who was convicted in the Anoka County District Court of domestic abuse. The same individual was later arrested for second-degree assault for a dangerous weapon, and terroristic threats, and reckless disregard. ICE's Immigration Authority helped ensure the perpetrators arrested during the past several weeks can no longer inflict the pain and suffering of domestic violence on their victims. We will not allow that, and certainly not on our watch, not when we have the opportunity to prevent it. Just last week, I also announced the results of Operation Optical Illusion, an operation focusing on visa fraud in our student employment and occupational pathways. There, more than 15 individuals were administratively arrested as they were found out of status of their visa obligations. More than 40 other individuals are still under review and investigation. That same week, we opened the Center to Combat Human Trafficking, which was created to enhance investigations into forced labor and sex trafficking, to provide material support to the victims of trafficking, and most importantly, to provide educational opportunities to our local communities about the devastating impact of human trafficking. Additionally, earlier this month, ICE conducted Operation Rise in cities across the country that refused to cooperate with our efforts to strengthen public safety. Through the success of Operation Rise, ICE officers arrested 300 individuals in these non-cooperative jurisdictions where local law enforcement agencies are told not to call us when they encounter someone in the country illegally. These sanctuary cities do a disservice to our nation, and it's time the American people know about it and hear about it. When local officials refuse to cooperate by simply transferring over a criminal alien in the safe confines of a jail, ICE must go into the community in search of these individuals. There are times preventable tragic results occur based upon these non-cooperative policies. Too often, a simple phone call to ICE would have prevented a crime and might have saved a life. When non-cooperative jurisdictions ignore a lawful detainer request and release an alien who is wanted by ICE, public safety is compromised, and our communities are unnecessarily at risk because every subsequent crime is preventable. That cooperation would have saved Carlos Wolf and Sandra Cohen, who were killed by an individual wanted by ICE. This wanted alien has been arrested twice, or had been arrested twice, by local officials who failed to turn him over to us. Had he been turned over to ICE, Mr. Wolf's family and Mr. Cohen's family would still have their loved ones here today. That very same phone call could have and would have saved Mr. Rocky Jones, who was killed by an alien who was also wanted by ICE, but was released into the community by a non-cooperative jurisdiction in California. Folks, I say their names so we can honor them and remember their tragic stories as victims of crimes which could have been prevented but for the senseless non-cooperative policies. As I have stated previously, we have a mutually shared responsibility to protect this country, serve our communities, and safeguard the American people. A part of this duty requires ICE to enforce hundreds of immigration laws, which are intended to protect the American people. In the month of October, you can see in our enforcement efforts, ICE's subject matter equity spans from enforcement of immigration laws in the interior of the United States to investigating fraudulent visa behavior, all the way to dismantling human trafficking syndicates. In all ICE equities, effective and cooperative law enforcement requires mutually beneficial local, state, and federal partnerships. It is my hopes as the new acting director that as we inform the communities across the United States of our wide-ranging subject matter operations and equities, we can begin to build these much-needed local, state, and federal partnerships. Our communities need it, our country demands it, and the American people deserve our best efforts. Thank you again for joining us for this important announcement, and at this time I want to turn things over to Mr. Marcos Charles, the Field Office Director for St. Paul, Minnesota, for additional details on last week's operation, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. Charles.
Good morning. My name is Marcos Charles, and I'm the Field Office Director for Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Removal Operations for the St. Paul Field Office. I want to welcome Acting Director Pham to the St. Paul Field Office to thank him for his dedication and support for the ERO mission. I also want to thank the men and women of ICE who remain committed to removing dangerous criminals from our communities and restoring integrity to the nation's immigration system despite unwarranted criticism. Finally, I want to thank the journalists covering this event and informing the public of the hard work this agency performs each day for the deserving people of this great region. I support open dialogue, and I look forward to continued engagements like this. The officers and support staff of ICE remain committed to promoting public safety and working tirelessly to keep our community safe, boldly share with local and state law enforcement agencies. To those ends, ICE continues to enhance public safety through the arrest of illegal aliens with egregious criminal histories. As with our day-to-day enforcement operations, the announcement of these recent actions is meant to inform the public about the presence of dangerous criminals throughout our communities, many of whom victimize people in the same communities. Acting Director Pham announced the overall results of Operation Granite. I now have the honor of announcing the local results that highlight the hard work performed by the men and women of ICE ERO St. Paul. During Operation Granite, that ran from October 19 through 23, deportation officers in St. Paul arrested 31 illegal aliens in Minnesota, 30 of whom were arrested in the Metro County area to include Woodbury, Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, St. Paul, North St. Paul, South St. Paul, Columbia Heights, Minneapolis, Burnsville, Randolph, Anoka, Bloomington, Fort Snelling, Fridley, Rosemont, and Edina. Of those arrested, 77% have prior convictions or pending criminal charges. The charges and convictions included sexual exploitation of a child, sexual assault, child cruelty, assault, domestic violence, burglary, dangerous drugs, influence, rioting, racketeering, and mail fraud. The subjects arrested were from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Ecuador, Romania, and Somalia, 11 of whom had one or more prior deportations, and one of whom was a known gang member. Of particular local interest, on October 22nd, deportation officers arrested 2 illegal aliens charged with sex crimes, one charged with criminal sexual conduct with a victim under 13, and one charged with criminal sexual conduct and domestic assault by strangulation. On the same day, officers arrested an illegal alien with a prior conviction for racketeering for his part in a $10 million real estate scheme that preyed upon communities within the Twin Cities area. The criminal was deported in 2016, but managed to illegally re-enter the country and was residing once again in our community. He is now facing federal criminal prosecution for his felony illegal re-entry. Additionally, officers arrested an illegal alien with pending charges for rioting during the recent civil unrest in Minneapolis. The result of Operation Granite underscores ICE's commitment to preserving the integrity of U.S. immigration laws by identifying, arresting, and removing aliens who present a danger to national security or are a risk to public safety, as well as those who enter the United States illegally. This commitment is something the men and women of ICE display every day, placing their lives to keep the communities of our nation safe. Thank you again, and I pass it back to Director Pham for any questions.
Very good. At this time, I'm going to take the opportunity to open the floor for any questions that folks may have. Since I'm new and I'm a lefty, so I'll go to the right if that's okay. Yes, ma'am. And as I get to know our folks in the Minnesota area, I apologize if I can ask your name. So. Okay.
I know that you mentioned about 70% have pending criminal charges, criminal histories. Just curious about the remainder of those that were apprehended, just for clarification.
Sure. 70% had criminal convictions and pending criminal charges. Want to clarify that question because I think the as we try to work the room, unless out, if I may. Yes. When we have a surge in need to identify criminal aliens across the United States. And part of the conversation we were having for the last few weeks, ever since I focusing on cooperative jurisdictions, we feel that individuals were being released back into the communities, so we had to focus on certain communities to be able to serve the resources in those areas. And so that would be why we were out in California, out in New York, out in Philly. Here we were in Missouri, I want to pronounce that correctly, as well as Texas. Yes, ma'am, as a follow-up. And I'm sorry, I didn't get your name as well. Brett, thank you. I apologize.
I know that with the other operations, Collusion, Rise, Granite, it's just a crackdown effort, but so close to the election season. What do you say to people who have opinions about that?
Sure, Charmaine. Let me say this. Let me recharacterize what you just said. It's not a crackdown effort. It is an effort. When I first took this position, in the very first few interviews that I gave, I made a promise to the American people. I made a promise to my workforce. My promise to them was to do a few things. One, to get out there, to visit them, to support them in the field, hence I'm here, to be able to show them that the director or the new acting director values the mission and values the work that they put in and day out after having been characterized in what I would call unfair, uncertain terms. That process led to our ability to look at various different equities. And in my statement, and I'm sorry it was a very lengthy statement, but I'm proud that I wrote it. But at the end of the day, part of our ability to show the workforce support is to talk to the American people directly, letting them know how wide array of what we call subject matters that we look at ICE. We're not just about interior enforcement on the immigration laws. We're more than that. We're also dealing with visa fraud overstays. I specifically mentioned the opening of the centers to combat human trafficking, where at that point in time, we literally had 2 surviving victims who summons the courage to tell their story in public in support of our efforts in ICE to combat human trafficking. So this is my public campaign messaging to the American people about the work that HSI, ICE, and ERO together do on a regular basis. So it's not a crackdown, certainly not a crackdown. It's an effort to lift up and bolster the morale of the workforce that has over time been mischaracterized for the work that they do, applying the immigration laws that Congress gave to us to do. So thank you for that. All right, Brett, you seem to be on the hot seat. You and Charmaine are like tag teaming today, so.
Maybe this is a question for Marcos. I'm not sure, but either one. So 31 were from Minnesota, and I think the number was 104 or something like that. So does it seem like Minnesota is more of a problem area for this, trying to arrest these illegal aliens? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out a little bit more about that's a pretty, because there was a lot of states named in that press release. So Minnesota clearly has a lot.
Do you want to take that? Sure.
Thanks, Brett. So throughout the operation, there was 11 arrested in Chicago area responsibility. There were 27 in Detroit area responsibility. San Antonio area responsibility had 35, and Minnesota had 31. So it was pretty well spread out for the most part, so there was no necessarily more focus in the Minnesota area.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Rob. Okay, I was going to call you Bob for a second there.
You mentioned, and you mentioned the states here that were targeting these. You said there are areas that maybe you're not getting cooperation in. Could you elaborate on how these specific states were chosen for these operations?
Well, sometimes we'll have certain localities that have implemented their own leadership decisions on not to make phone calls to us or advise us of when an individual needs to be released. And then there are times where we'll have an entire state like California impanel legislation prohibiting cooperation with immigration officials. So the identification of the localities and the states would boil down to our methodology in looking at how many detainers were issued and how many were denied. And then we walk through that methodology to identify the jurisdictions that we feel that our resources need to be what I call surged into, so that way we can look for these individuals, quite frankly, that would have been much easier if they had been tendered over to ICE's custody in that correctional facility.
And let me follow up quick too.
Sure.
Then this operation, how long has this been? I know you can't go into details, but has this been something that's been planned for a while? Or is this something that is kind of getting into this? How often this has been done? Has this been in the works for a while?
Again, we don't typically comment on the operational background on those issues, but we can, or I would feel comfortable providing information with regard to these are things that we look at in looking at because we have limited resources. And we have a very large footprint. Minneapolis, Minnesota is one AOR area, but we have, I'm learning now as the new acting director that we have such a large footprint across the United States. We're exploring and looking at different areas where we can focus our efforts and focus our resources that would, quite frankly, yield a much larger result. So we will pivot, we will look, we will analyze, we will review the data that comes in, and then we will make operational decisions based upon that information from this past month's operation for future purposes. Okay? Yep.
Can you talk about how COVID has affected your operations over the past 3 months and whether also you mentioned limited resources. So are you also working with Border Patrol in the northern Minnesota area?
So the question, I think, for folks, if I can restate the question, if that's okay, ma'am, the question was about how has COVID impacted our operations. You know, COVID was new on the scene, and a lot of organizations took some time to really review and analyze their operational status and posture. We felt that after a few months, we had a good grapple and a good handle on the CDC guidance through our efforts with our pandemic response review process and the documents that we sent out to a lot of the detention facilities, that we had a good handle on how we were going to approach completing our mission, applying the laws that the American people expect of us to do, and that Congress impaneled laws for us to do, and do so in a safe manner. So our operational posture will always include agents and officers in the field wearing the appropriate PPE, following the appropriate CDC guidance on distancing when we encounter, the expectations are when we encounter individuals that we are announcing that we had picked up today, that they are also provided the appropriate level of protective gear and protective equipment, and we do so in the same manner in compliance with the CDC guidelines. So that was a very good question. I appreciate that. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time here today. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to our local OPA office, and we'll try to get you an answer accordingly.